Okay, welcome to the fifth and last part of this week's cognitive psychology lecture on language. And in this part we will cover two different topics. The first one is word recognition and the other one is text comprehension. Okay, let's start with visual word recognition. And as you can see in this Garfield comic strip, if we have learned to read and if we see a word, our eyes fall into a word, then we can't stop reading it. We can't help it. We have to read. So reading is fully automatic. However, although it's automatic, it's quite strongly influenced by practice. And so there's actually quite a little bit of a culture about reading speed, and you can train reading speed, and there are championships and things like that. So a typical college student reads roughly around 200 to 230 words per minute. And when we speak about reading, we are always speaking about reading with a certain amount of comprehension, at least. Really good students, good at reading, can read up to 600 words per minute. And if you do speed reading trainings to get to this speed, then you learn certain techniques, such as skimming, for instance. So you screen the text for important information and try to skip and ignore unimportant information which is not relevant for the story, for instance, if you read a book. And in general, the rule is that there is a trade-off, and the faster you read, the less you comprehend. So faster reading results in less comprehension. And the real good people with the speed reading training, taking part at championships and so forth, they are usually around 1,000 to 2,000 words per minute, which is already quite more than this, and usually they have around 50% comprehension. And the world champion, at least at the time when I made these slides, was Anne Jones, and she read around 4,500 words per minute with 67% comprehension, so pretty good. And I think the last Harry Potter book she read in like 45 minutes or something like that. So it is pretty impressive. Now, I already mentioned word recognition is automatic, but still it can be trained so that we get faster and faster. So in class, I would usually now do a little exercise where you can test your reading speed. I will skip that here, but if you're interested, you just have to Google that, and there are quite a few online tests which are much nicer to do yourself on the computer than such a thing now with this virtual learning. So we skip that part. Okay, so there's an interesting finding around that, and that is that the automaticity of reading words helps us in identifying individual letters. And this is called the word superiority effect. Let's have a look how an experiment to show this effect looks like. And here the task for the participant is to identify a letter. So first they see a blank screen, then they see a letter which they have to identify, and this letter is presented very, very briefly only and then masked immediately afterwards. So it's actually quite difficult to identify that letter, and then they have a choice. The underlined letter, was it a D or was it a G? D, press left button, G, press right button. Okay, so this is one condition, and participants make many trials of that, and you get an average response time, how long it takes you to make that decision. And people, of course, try to be as quick as possible. And then we have a pretty similar task, but this is not the letter condition, but the word condition. So the task is basically the same, but now the underlined letter is part of a word, of a proper word, like ride, for instance. And then this is masked, so hard to identify, and then the question is D or G. And what is found, if you do that study, that in this condition, people are faster than in this condition. You might also have predicted something different, because here the visual display is more cluttered, so it might actually be more difficult to identify the underlined letter, but people are faster. And the idea is that it's the word surrounding, because we automatically read the word, and then if you think back about these networks of semantic priming, the letter D gets also activation from the fact that the whole word containing a D is activated. So people are faster with that. Okay, so when we want to investigate how we read, how we recognize visual words and sentences, eye tracking is a very popular method, and this is an example of an eye tracker. It's a little bit more old-fashioned model, and here what you see is that the person has this thing on their head, and that here they have two cameras looking at the eyes to register where the pupil is, and you can see that here as well. And then we have on the screen these LEDs or infrared lights, and an additional camera here on the head measures that the relative position of the head with the monitor, towards the monitor. So after an initial calibration, even if the participant would move their head, you know pretty exactly where on the screen they are looking at. This is one where you don't need any cameras on your head, so the technique doesn't stop. So the cameras are here mounted on a laptop screen, and you can do it that way as well. These techniques are much more accurate as what you may see in modern smartphones. Sometimes they have functions like when you are reading and you come to the bottom of the screen, they will automatically scroll upwards. So they try also to see where you're looking at, but these cameras are much more accurate and also much faster. So the time resolution is much higher of these cameras. Okay, so when we do eye movements, then you may know and may have realized that they are not smooth, but by so-called saccades. And each saccade lasts around 10 to 20 minutes. So not minutes, of course, milliseconds. And you can try that for a moment when you look at the screen here, at the text for instance, whether you can move your eyes smoothly over the text here, whether that works or not. And or anything else, you can look out of the window or something and you can see whether you can move your eyes smoothly. I will wait now for a few seconds, but if you want to try around a little bit more, then you can pause the video. Okay, it will not work, did it? So if you screen and scan a scene, it's not possible. However, you actually can do that, and I will show you how. And for this it's necessary I will do two demonstrations, one with the mouse cursor, and if you watch this via Panopto, you have to take a certain setting to actually see the mouse cursor, but I will do that in a moment with my finger as well. So look at the red mouse cursor here, and just follow it with your eye. And then suddenly you will notice you can see that. So for those who don't see the mouse, just follow my finger. So when we are tracking something, we can do that with a smooth pursuit eye movement, but when we look around, it's just in saccades. And now important for the reading bit is that between the saccades we do so-called fixations. So we fixate something for a moment until our brain thinks they took up all required information, and then we jump to the next fixation by using a saccade and jump around. So this is the same process happening in reading. And sorry. So why does it do that? My mouse always scrolls forward, backward. In reading, the fixations take around 200 to 250 milliseconds, so roughly a fifth to a quarter of a second when you're a good reader. And if you're a poor reader or children, then they fixate each word longer. So it takes you longer to process that, and you're slower at reading. Also, if the text is very difficult to understand, to process, then this also affects your duration to fixate something, and you become slower. Importantly, the information is gathered only during the fixation and not during the saccade. So when you're jumping to a new point, you're kind of blind, you may say so, in this time. And if you now do eye tracking and you see where exactly people were looking at which words, you can show that in such a diagram like this. So you have a fixation here, you have another fixation here, the next fixation is here. And then these are the saccades, the jumps. And yet then you can see that sometimes you can see where do people look at, or what do they jump over, and certain behaviors. For instance, you see healthy, and then the person jumped to seem, and then they may have realized, and this happens automatically, that that was too far ahead and they missed some information. So in a so-called regression, they go back and jump forward in smaller steps. And I would like to present a small video which illustrates how we read and how our reading, our fixations are adapted, manipulated, adjusted to different types of texts. So left aligned, right aligned, all capital letters, and things like that. Okay, let me do that. I think there's no sound with this video. Let me put that a little bit bigger. Okay, here we go. And this is nice and smooth. You see that they often jump to the wrong start of the line, so it gets slower. You see here they jump where actually no text is, because they assume the line is here. The line starts here. Same thing happening in right-aligned text. So you see additional saccades are required. This of course holds for the cultures who usually read from left to right, otherwise it's the opposite effect. You see how it slows down these larger gaps. Because the automatic system can't find that easily where the next point is. Again, you see it takes much longer, the fixations are much longer, and one reason is that it's much harder to identify where the boundaries are between words. So here they call it word shape. You see here they went back. So as a summary, use left-aligned text for reading. And although the blocked text, so where the left is a straight line and right is a straight line, may look nice, for reading it's better to use left aligned. And if you use the fully aligned, so that you have on the right, make sure you use these, how's it called, that you split the words, with the hyphenation, so that it continues, because then the word processors can align them and you can avoid the big gaps between the words. Okay, let's continue. continue here. When we talk about reading, a concept which is quite important is called the perceptual span. And this is the effective field of view for reading. And this is actually larger than our foveal vision. And if you remember, the foveal vision is the area where the fovea is, where we have the clearest and sharpest vision, the most accurate vision. And then to the periphery, it becomes more and more blurred. So here this is simulated, and they call it acuity here. So this would be roughly the area of the fovea, and then we see it how it gets more and more blurred towards the outside. And however, when we are reading, even this low acuity information, so where we may not even be able to read the letters, is used to identify the word shapes and the target of the next saccade. So where are we going to jump to? So we can see, okay, maybe we can't read that, says letters, but we see it's a word, and we should point our next saccade in the middle of that word. And this perceptual span is affected by a lot of things. So like the size of the print, the difficulty of the text, the expertise of the reader, so how far ahead do you jump, and things like that. Okay, and usually the perceptual span is not symmetric. So we have only 3 to 4 letters to the left of the fixation point and around 15 letters to the right. And in Hebrew, where we read from right to left, it's exactly the opposite. So then you would have 3 to 4 letters to the right and around 15 letters to the left. Okay, so let's continue with that. And there are differences in how much attention we pay on the words, and how often and frequently they are the target of fixation points, and how long we look at them. And around 80% of the content words are fixated, but only around 20% of the function words, like the or a, because they often can be inferred from the context. Okay, functionality is one thing, the frequency of words, and there are really libraries where it's listed for each word in a language how frequent it is. And frequent means in like normal text, like newspapers, magazines, books, and so forth. So there are statistics about the frequency. And people have found out that rare words are fixated longer than common words, which are frequent in the language. Also the predictability. If words are highly predictable from the context or are very short words, then they are fixated for less time, or maybe even not at all, and they are jumped over with a saccade. And this whole topic of visual word recognition is nicely summarized in the next video we'll have a look at.
We were reading a new book, and I had one little girl who was just really struggling with the book, and she was trying to sound out some of the words, but she was just having some problems. And so about halfway through the book, she just closed the book and she slid the book across the table to me and said, "You know what, Miss Buckley, I don't need to know how to read this book because I'm going to be a supermodel, and whenever I'm a supermodel, I don't have to read these books."
Reading is one of the most dazzling mental skills that people learn. We seldom think about just how much is involved. Our eyes move from left to right in a series of quick leaps, resting or fixating on a word for a sliver of a second before moving ahead.
Okay, if you could look straight ahead, please.
Okay.
At the University of Massachusetts, a research lab is investigating what good readers do with their eyes. Dr. Keith Rayner is director of the lab.
I've spent my life using eye movements as a way to understand reading and scene perception and visual search and other things, because it seems to me that eye movements are a very good indicator of the mental processes that people engage in.
Okay, could you look at the upper right-hand corner of the screen, please?
Dr. Rayner has found that skilled readers take in information from a surprisingly small area around the fixation point. 3 or 4 letters to the left of fixation and about 15 letters to the right.
Simply because of the physical wiring of the eye, you don't get much detail outside the point that you're looking at. You can try this experiment for yourself. Hold up your hand just a little bit off the line of sight, and you won't even be able to count your own fingers. That's how fuzzy it gets. So if you need fine detail, whether you're looking at a P or a Q or an H or a J, your eye has got to land right on the word. And indeed, studies of eye movements in reading have shown that good, even skilled, rapid readers pretty much land on every content word.
Good readers seldom backtrack. They fixate on each word for a quarter second before leaping ahead 8 or 9 letters.
Look straight ahead, please.
Good readers are highly systematic. Younger, less skilled readers spend more time on each word. They leap ahead shorter distances, and they back up more often.
They're going much slower because they're having much more difficulty encoding what the words are that they look at.
Though they are slower, young readers follow the same pattern as adults. They don't hunt around a page for context clues, but instead decode one word at a time as their eyes move methodically across the text.
Okay. So much for a summary. Questions again, please, to the BBL discussion board. And now we are coming to the last topic of this week's lecture, and this is about text comprehension. And text comprehension refers to our ability to read a complete text, to process it and understand its meaning. So it's the highest level and goes beyond words and sentences. It's about complete passages of text. And usually it's studied in reading by means of visual presentation, because it's just the easiest way to do that. And previous research has found that there are quite a few factors which affect or influence our ability to understand and comprehend text, such as language skills, so as low level as phonology, our knowledge of our skills in syntax, semantics, pragmatics, the things we spoke about in the first part, they all influence that. So in school children, for instance, these things like how well are children in being able to rhyme or create rhymes can be a predictor of later abilities of text understanding, because these are the building stones of that. Our ability to recognize words very quickly and effortlessly. So how much practice do we have? How much automaticity do we have in word reading? But also like higher level things like prior knowledge about the subject. If I know the topic very well, I can comprehend the text much better. So if I, as a psychologist, read another psychology article, that's much easier than something about nuclear physics, where I will struggle and be much slower in reading. Also, our general abilities to make inferences, so to infer on something, making logical connections, because text comprehension is not about just reading the words, but really taking out the meaning of it, and often these are logical steps. And also to have the skill of monitoring that comprehension, so to decide what is important of the text. Why is it important? Should I try to memorize it, or can it be ignored and rejected? Do I need to read the entire text, or is part of it sufficient? Things like that. And then we have something which is called working memory. Just 1 second, I have to pause the video. And working memory has been shown to affect our text comprehension. And this is the only factor I would like to present in a little bit more detail. in this context. Okay, so the role of working memory has been investigated by Justin Carpenter, and they proposed a capacity theory, so working memory capacity, and the idea of working memory, as we discussed before, is that we have the short-term storage of information plus the ability or capacity to process this information. So, and when we measure that, or the ability to do both at the same time, defines the working memory capacity. And this capacity is actually quite limited in people, and it varies quite a bit between individuals. And another word for working memory capacity is also working memory span, and it has been shown that this working memory span correlates, for instance, with general intelligence and outcome in school and things like that. And Justin Carpenter created the so-called reading span task, which is used to assess the capacity of working memory, in particular in the domain of text comprehension. And this reading span task, there you have to read a list of sentences, one after the other, for comprehension. So you may be asked questions after you have read all the sentences in the very end. For instance, is this statement true or false, depending on what you have read? Or you may be asked statements directly after each sentence. This is one task. This is the processing task, which demands the processing of your mind. And then to tax the memory component, the storage component of working memory, you have to memorize the last word of each sentence. And later you have to recall it in the correct order of their presentation. So you have this monitoring, the sequencing aspect there as well. So as an example, you can get something to write, just a pen and a piece of paper, and we will have an easy version of that, and try to read the sentences very attentively, so that later on you can be asked questions about the content of the sentences and memorize the last word of each sentence. Okay, ready, set, go. Okay, please write down the words in the order of presentation. You can pause the video if you want to think about this for a moment. I will continue now. So the right words were in the order zoo, wide, moon, funny. We don't do the comprehension test now, but if you have processed that already with the expectation to be asked, then this should mimic this quite okay. So this is an example, a typical example of these working memory spans where you have to do two things at the same time. And this one is focused on the reading. And it has been shown that this reading span, so what you would do now is you run several trials of that, and you vary the number of sentences and words. So you determine what's the longest list a participant can reproduce correctly. And it might be that the span is something around 3, 4, 5 sentences. And this is then the span score. And this reading span score correlates with text comprehension abilities. And this is a good indication that working memory capacity is indeed an important factor for text comprehension. So people with a really high reading span are shown that they make a lot of use of semantic cues, for example, in the text, and may even be able to maintain two different syntactic interpretations of the sentence in parallel. We will talk about this in the next session, how we parse the syntax of sentences, and the idea is that usually the assumption is that we when the words come in word by word when we read, then we create syntactical structures and we use the most likely one of what we think how the grammar of the sentence will be. What is the noun, what is a verb, what is an object, relative clauses, and things like that. And these people are able sometimes to maintain two interpretations until a certain word which disambiguates, so that you know which interpretation is the correct one. So, taken together, working memory capacity is really an important factor in determining our text comprehension, among other factors as well, as we have discussed in the beginning. As usual, if you have any questions, post them on BBL. Thanks for listening to this lecture, and then next week we will continue with language in the second part.